in listen-only mode.
Hello, Florida. How are you all doing after your storm? I'm so glad to have you here with us. I'm Tracy Hansen. I am the Agent Relations Specialist with Allison James Estates and Homes. And before we get started, I want to point out our Getting Started button for you. And just so you know, this is where you can go and sign up on a one-on-one call with me. If you have any questions about Allison James University, SkySlope, or our coaching program that has now gone national. So with that being said, this is where you find me for all questions. And I would like to say hello to Robert Milligan, our Florida broker. Hello, Robert.
Hey there.
Hi. Okay, so this morning you're going to be talking about as is versus a standard contract, which I think
That is
as agents we all need to know that there is a difference.
absolutely, that's correct. And I'm happy to be here and hopefully get you guys some good information. So, basically, before we even jump into that, I thought I'd maybe just take a second to say, since we're basically at the first of the month, or, technically October 2nd, but we're all really just getting back in the swing now. And as we just came through this hurricane and everything for September, September was kind of an off month for a lot of us, and it was distracting and took a lot of energy to out of our market. And there was about a week and a half where there was really no deals to speak of. But it's so great that we're now at the beginning of a brand new month. And a mentor that I had, he used to always tell me that winners win in a muddy field, losers lose in the best conditions. And I always like that because, there's always some reason to find excuses. If any of us try real hard, we can always come up with an excuse. But and for a lot of us, Irma was a muddy field. That's definitely not ideal conditions for having a robust real estate market. But here we are in a brand new month, and there are chances that we'll have some surprises of our own as we go along in the month. But nevertheless, we're winners, and we're off to a good start. And I'm feeling really optimistic about this month, and really glad to close the chapter on September. so, as we mentioned here, we're going to talk a little bit about the two different options that you have in contracts, and I'll just give some kind of basic pointers along the way. But some of you may or may not be aware that there is a difference between a FAR bar standard contract and a FAR bar as is contract. And a lot of brokerages definitely prefer one over the other, and they don't all prefer the same one, which is kind of interesting. I know of a few brokerages in town that really promote the standard contract for their agents, and my personal preference happens to be the as is contract. And there's really no wrong answer. It's just a matter of the objective and the outcome that you're hoping to achieve for your customer. And also, of course, it matters which side of the transaction that you're on as well. And some of the principles here is that, it's kind of obvious, I think, that a as-is contract is going to be a little bit more simple of a transaction, which for me is a big priority. I don't like to create contention and conflicts and misunderstandings. I prefer for the transactions I'm involved in to be very simple with very easily managed expectations so that things don't get off track and get into the weeds. And so when you're looking at these two different contracts, some advantages of the as-is contract would be, like I mentioned, that it's just very simple. It's very clean for your buyer and your seller, but it's clean for your buyer that they can easily get out of the contract within a very definitive time period, and they don't really have to demonstrate any super specific reason why they're wanting to get out of the contract. They can basically just back out in their sole discretion. I think that's generally an advantage for everyone. And some advantages of the standard contract would be for the seller. It does kind of create a more committed buyer, because if the house is very clean and there's not really a lot of repairs that are going to be expected, then it actually makes it a little bit more difficult for the buyer to get out, because they have to find some things that are wrong with the house. So I happen to have both of these contracts in front of me, and you can maybe reference back to these things, but I'll just kind of keep it simple, and I'll just cite some paragraph numbers as we go along here. But both of these contracts are going to be basically the same until you get to paragraph 9, which is going to be the costs to be paid by the seller. So on the standard contract, the costs to be paid by the seller, and it is worth noting that the standard contract is about 1.5 pages longer than the as-is contract, because there's a lot of extra language that, you know, attempts to deal with some of these things, and I still don't think that it's very clean myself, but we'll get into further detail as we go along here. But in the standard contract at paragraph 9, you'll notice as you read down just a little bit, starting on line 136, it says that, you know, the way it's built in automatically, that the seller is obligated to pay for the following costs and expenses of up to 1.5%, if left blank, for the general repair items, 1.5% for WDO treatment and repairs, and 1.5% for costs associated with closing out open or expired building permits and obtaining building permits. So, you know, on a, you know, transaction in our market, you know, $300,000 is kind of like an average transaction. You know, that amount, if these things are just left blank as they're written into the contract, could equate to about $13,500 in costs for the seller. So, you know, some advantages of that would be that, you know, this could potentially create a more committed buyer, because if the buyer is unable to find any repairs, if the house is, you know, in very good condition, it would be much more difficult for the buyer to get out of the contract, and they would have to find, you know, things that are wrong with the house that exceed those dollar limits. So, you know, that's an advantage for the seller. But, you know, where things get difficult, in my opinion, with the standard contract is whenever repairs are requested and the seller intends to actually make those repairs versus just providing a credit. And, you know, in my experience, I would avoid at all costs having the seller actually make the physical repairs. And, you know, there's different trains of thought on this. Some sellers are going to feel very strongly one way or the other. A lot of sellers feel like if they do make those repairs, they can make those repairs themselves much more inexpensively than if they, you know, just made a credit. And but, you know, the seller does have to keep in mind that all of these repairs must be done by a licensed contractor, a licensed and insured professional contractor. So, you know, the seller really, once these repairs are requested, are not able to, you know, even if it's simple things, they're not really able to go out to, you know, Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever their hardware store of choice is and just kind of, you know, put these things together on their own. They really do need to get licensed and insured professionals to come in and make these repairs. So what I have seen quite a bit is whenever the repairs are made, and that's where, if you go all the way down, I think it's 12, paragraph 12, yeah, where there's a lot of extra language here that says, you know, if the repairs and inspections are, you know, being made here, that there's a re-inspection of the property, and there's just tons and tons of language about how, you know, this situation all plays out. And so, you know, they have the property re-inspected, and where I run into a lot of trouble is where, you know, the buyer comes in and they see things that the seller did that's not to their satisfaction, because there's no way to really definitively measure, like, how is it appropriately repaired. You know, one person's standard is always going to be different than another person's standard. And the seller is always, of course, looking to try to basically, you know, repair the house as inexpensively as possible, typically, if that's, you know, they're not going to be there too terribly much longer. So whenever you really start looking into number 12, that's where all the extra language is all added into the standard contract versus the as-is contract. And if you actually read it, I'm not going to bore you and read all of these things, because I know that you can all read. But, you know, whenever these repairs are made, there's a re-inspection, and the condition, I mean, there's just so much language about how everything needs to be, you know, perfectly maintained and delivered, and, you know, it's just, it gets really overwhelming and consuming quickly. So, I mean, we've seen, you know, just, I've seen different disagreements over silly stuff like fixing a track on a sliding glass door, and, you know, the buyer didn't think it was appropriately fixed, or the crank on a window, or just like all kinds of silly stuff like that. And or the seller tried to, you know, do something inexpensively, and they just went and did something that, you know, they could have done appropriately and fixed on their own, and they bought some, you know, some small parts to do it on their own at the hardware store, but, you know, technically they're in breach of contract by not having someone that's licensed and insured do that. So those are some of the things that are kind of slippery. With as-is contract, what I like about it is that, you know, generally there's going to be a credit made, if anything. Everybody's expectations were managed a little bit better. and it's easy for the buyer to get out if that's what the buyer decides to do. And I think that it's important because no matter a standard or as is contract, there's no way that you're not going to have a little bit of a period of faith in each other that the buyer is actually going to perform. The seller in either of these contracts is going to have to take the house off the market for a little while and just have to trust that the buyer is actually going to perform. So what I would recommend and what my personal preference and style is have an as-is contract, but maybe if you're trying to protect your seller, if you're on the seller side of the transaction, maybe just limit the time period on the inspection contingency period a little bit. Instead of it being the default 15 days, maybe just leave it at 10 days or 7 days, or if it's like a quick cash deal, something along those lines, even 5 days is appropriate. But that way the seller knows that the buyer's going to poke around, and if they see anything that's not to their liking, then in a reasonably short amount of time, without taking the house off the market too long, the buyer can get out and everybody cleanly goes on their way. So that's something that I generally prefer. And if you are on the buyer side, if you've got a buyer that really is thorough and they really do want the best of both worlds, I don't know as though sellers would always necessarily accept this, but this is perhaps an interesting pro tip for you. You can have your buyer use a standard contract that does obligate the seller to a certain amount of repairs. And so that way it is predefined that the seller does expect that they will have some repairs to make based on the inspection report. But you can also have the buyer execute a right to inspect and right to cancel addendum. And if the buyer does that, they really are able to have their cake and eat it too. So they can obligate the seller in advance to making some repairs or making some credits, but they can also enjoy the benefit of your as-is contract, which is that basically they can determine in their sole discretion that if it's not acceptable to them for any reason, and I do mean any, they realize there's a crack in the sidewalk that they didn't like on the way into the property or whatever silly, ridiculous thing, they don't have to cite it, but they can get out in their sole discretion. So, that's something that if you have a buyer that is, really concerned about the condition, or perhaps they, are using all the money in the world that they have and they're really worried that they don't have any money left over after making this purchase to be able to perform or complete any repairs, perhaps using a standard contract and also using that right to inspect and right to cancel addendum, that could be a good solution for a buyer like that. So, of course, there's different strategies whenever we're working on a buyer side versus working on a seller side. And I always think that using any of these contracts and structuring any deal is kind of like playing a game of chess. And I am always happy to help whenever you're finding yourself in that situation and you're wondering which way to go. You can reach out to me anytime for any advice for that kind of thing. But if it's I'll give a couple hypothetical scenarios perhaps. If it's a very hot property with multiple offers and you're trying to make your offer as strong as you absolutely can, I would limit your I would definitely use an as-is contract in that instance. I would also try to limit that inspection time frame to a very short time frame, perhaps only 5 days, because then maybe your offer will look less risky than accepting another competing offer that has a 15-day inspection period. And I would also encourage you maybe to have the buyer consider making a larger escrow deposit. And we've done a lot of distressed and bank-owned properties in our part of Florida and actually across the whole state. And I've seen aggressive buyers that will actually put the entire escrow deposit amount, the entire purchase price, I'm sorry, into escrow. So if it's a $100,000 purchase, they're just making a $100,000 escrow deposit right off the bat, just to basically demonstrate to the seller, like, here's all my cash, going to just take it off the market for 3 days or 5 days or whatever the case is. And as soon as we're through that time frame, then I'm good to go, I'm good to close. And so that, that could be a good strategy for that type of a position versus, maybe like the other scenario I just mentioned, where somebody doesn't have a lot of money and they're not really concerned about losing the house because there's not other offers or anything. Then maybe a standard contract with the right to inspect and right to cancel addendum might work out for that sort of a buyer. So, and then when you're on the seller side, same thing. I always just kind of assess the situation and assess what the seller's position is. Sometimes our sellers, they are, not afraid of making repairs and they're confident that their house is in very good condition. Other times sellers are, that they're financially distressed and they don't really have a lot of extra money to make repairs or make credits. And, so we're just trying to structure that deal and create the best scenario and the best outcome for our seller, depending on the feedback that we're getting from them. So that's basically, I do encourage you to just take a little bit of time and read between the differences of the as-is contract and the differences in the standard contract. And again, in both of these, the main differences are going to be in paragraph 9 and also in paragraph 12. So you can read through that in your own time. I don't want to sit here and read that to you. I know you can read. But I thought also I'd just give a couple pointers before we adjourn here today. And also, if there's any questions that anybody has, feel free to type those questions in and ask. Or we can do that live and have a discussion here, or we can do that anytime that you want to email or call me. I'm happy to help with whatever your specific situation is. But a couple things that I thought I'd just give you like a few like 101 pointers, and I'm going to basically just work from the lines on the as-is contract, but they're pretty much identical with the exceptions that we just talked about. But you want to make sure that you completely fill in all of this information, and most of you know that I don't like to leave anything blank, even if it says like 15 days if left blank. I write the 15 in. I just don't like to let anything open for misinterpretation. So the other thing is that on line 29, we don't have an escrow account when many brokerages choose not to have escrow accounts. So I would recommend checking that second box that the escrow deposit is to be made within 3 days if left blank. That that by the time this is an effective contract, it's usually been determined who's paying for title, who is the title agent's actually going to be, and so you have 3 days from the effective date to actually get your escrow deposits completed. So that makes that a lot easier, and of course you fill in and complete that information. And it's also great to know, just like a little 101 tip, what the effective day is. And so hypothetically, if today, Monday, is October 2nd, if this contract were fully executed, and by that I mean fully initialed and everything, if there's missing initials and that goes till tomorrow before you get the missing initials back, then the effective date is actually going to be tomorrow. But assuming everything was effective and all the initials, everything are done today, October 2nd, today is the effective date, but tomorrow, the 3rd, is actually day 1. So if you were, calculating your time periods when your escrow deposit would be due, it would be, Tuesday's the first day, Wednesday's the second day, and Thursday's the 3rd day. So it would actually be by midnight on Thursday would be your time period to get your escrow deposit in. But obviously, unless you're doing a bank wire or something, most institutions close at 5, so you got to take care of that before everybody closes. So, but that just gives you an idea and how to calculate your effective dates, and it works the same way for your inspection period timelines, for your finance contingencies. So moving on down the contract a little bit, another tip that you can do that seems to come in handy a lot is the closing date. And on line 52, I like to fill that in as a time period rather than an actual date, because sometimes whenever you're preparing the offer, you don't know, it might take half a week or even a week to actually get the effective document executed and returned and delivered to everybody. And these contracts, by the way, are not effective until they're actually delivered to all parties. So there's a lot of interesting scenarios that come up with that, where you might have your customers, you might have an effective contract in your possession, but you might be driving it back to the office and haven't actually scanned it and sent it to the other agent yet. If you wait till the next day, the following day would actually be the effective date because it needs to be delivered. But on this closing date, I like writing in on line 52 an actual time period. You might write 30 days or 45 days, and that way the closing date is calculated as a derivative of the effective date. And that way, if it takes a half a week or a week to actually negotiate the contract, you're not losing all of that time on your finance contingencies and or shortening the closing so much that it makes it a burden and causes you to possibly need to extend later on. So that's just something that you might want to keep in mind. And then financing, that's kind of self-explanatory, whether or not you're paying cash or whether or not it's contingent. But again, use that time period. And I think 30 days has been appropriate for the most part. For most lenders right now, it seems like underwriting and everything's kind of picking back up. But I'm just looking through here. We do recommend home warranties. That's just a good practice to get into because customers have misdirected anger if you're the one that sold them the home and the dishwasher breaks, and for whatever reason that is your fault sometimes in their mind at least. So these home warranties are inexpensive, and they just help everybody remain warm and fuzzy throughout the whole transaction. And I will also mention that some of you are aware, but we're going to make sure that everybody's a little bit more intentional about the email address that our SkySlope system creates. Whenever you create a new transaction, you'll notice, if the transaction is 123 Main Street, when you enter that transaction in SkySlope, you'll notice in the heading of your SkySlope file there that it will make an email address that looks kind of like 123 Main Street at skyslope.com. Whenever you're corresponding with everybody, mortgage, title, your customers, the other realtor, start copying. You only have to do it once before it's saved in your email, but start copying that email address in all of your correspondence, and that way it's all saved in the cloud. If there's ever an audit or ever a problem with your file, then we can see all the correspondence there. But just looking through the contract to see if there's anything else that jumps out at me that's just kind of like a basic thing to know. Of course, we dealt quite a bit last month with force majeure, whenever people can't close due to services not being available due to the hurricane and things like that happened. And fortunately, we had quite a few contracts that were subject to that clause, and we were able to get all of those moving forward without any big disruptions or problems with anybody. But I believe that's looking like that's just about it. And I don't know if by chance there's any questions.
There
or any...
are. Yes, I was waiting for you before I can tell you. Yes, so we do have one from William, and he's asking, if you are the buyer, have the standard contract signed and want to cancel it because you changed your mind, what are your options and what are the consequences?
Yeah, well, it's definitely a lot easier to cancel an as-is contract. So with a standard contract, you're going to basically need to find something wrong with the house that exceeds those repair limits. And that's really the only renegotiation point that the buyer has, unless there are other, so that's the only condition-related clause that the buyer would have. The only other option that a buyer may have is if they have a financing contingency or some other contingency, maybe an appraisal contingency. But with the standard contract, the buyer really can't change their mind as easy as an as-is contract, and they may be subject to losing their escrow deposit if they just change their mind without any contractually valid reason, just because they get cold feet or whatever. So that's one of the reasons that some brokerages feel strongly that a standard contract is better when you're on the listing side, because it does create a more committed buyer. But arguably the house would have to be in really good condition. And to me, I feel like every transaction, whether it be financing or, every transaction has a little bit of a period where the seller just has to trust that the buyer is going to perform. And if it's not an inspection contingency, it is going to be a finance contingency or appraisal or some sort of contingency is almost always written into the contract. So for me, I prefer just short, just a very short as-is inspection contingency. And that way, after 5 days, everybody's on the same page that now the money's hard, with the exception of any other contingencies that might be hanging out there. And and it's easy for people to get what they want. So I hope that answered your question, William. But it would be tough for the buyer to get their money back if they just change their mind with the standard contract.
Right. Also, Lisa just wanted you to know that it's been very helpful for this quick summary.
Fantastic. And if there's anything else, Lisa, that you'd like to know, more info about, you can call or email anytime. I'm glad to help. Glad to know it helped you. Thanks for saying so.
All right. Well, with that being said, I think we have another question from Elizabeth Davis that is asking about a one-on-one with me, and I'm going to tell her, please email me at agents@ajicorporate.com if you cannot find on AJI University where to click for a one-on-one with me, and I'll be happy to help you set up that website you're talking about. So with that being said, I want to say thank you to Robert Milligan.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next month.
Yeah, and one quick thing that comes to mind too is just with us, going through the hurricane recently. We do have our in-house insurance partner for homeowners and flood and all sorts of insurance-related matters at XQuote. And if, I personally just audited my own policy, and if any of you, just taking a little time while we can write insurance right now before the next storm, if there is one, it might be a smart idea just if you dig up your own homeowner's insurance and have a scan of that, if you want to send it over, we're happy to audit your own policy. And for myself, I was able to get better coverage at actually a little bit less of a price, so I'll be in a better position if I do have any damages, but just something I wanted to mention that we're happy to offer to all of you as well.
All right. Well, with that being said, everybody go out and have a great week, and we'll see you next month. Thank you again, Robert.
Okay. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.